With your indulgence, before we start. Big question.
I've got no idea what this is about.
When you're ready to be introduced.
Okay, I'll zip through quickly.
amazing subliminal picture show. And it was a bit like, I felt ghosts exhumed from the grave. It was quite frightening, but it was immensely powerful, and I had no idea it was such good stuff. So John Turner hardly needs introducing, except to say that I believe his knowledge of the Burton brothers is one of his special areas of knowledge that we can be very thankful that he has.
Thank you, Rhondda. I'd like to dedicate my talk tonight to a friend, Barb Connew, who died on the 7th of May last week and was buried this morning. Some of you will have known her. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Real Pictures, especially Rhondda Bosworth and Ian MacDonald, for initiating this series of lectures, which I think is a really important event in Auckland, and we need more of them. On Wednesday, 13th of May, 1875, that's 102 years ago, Alfred Burton was quickly approaching his 51st birthday, and he was recording his impressions of the King Country with both his camera and pencil. He was born on 19 June 1984 in Leicester, England, and was the eldest son of John Burton and Martha Burton. And John Burton was at times a printer, a stationer, proprietor of a newspaper, and latterly a photographer. And his sons followed him in this photography line. Eventually, by the middle 60s, the Burtons had studios in not only in Leicester, but also in Nottingham and in Birmingham and in other centres in the middle of England. Alfred had, his next younger brother was Walter John Burton, who we'll hear of shortly, and he had other brothers who were also involved in photography in England, Oliver and John William Burton, who carried on the tradition well until the beginning of the first decades of this century. At this time, when Burton was in the King Country in 1885, when this picture was taken, that's Burton on the left, emerging from the whare with his hand on his camera bag, and the man on his left is William Peyton, who was a young drawer, painter, who accompanied this particular trip, and we'll hear more of him also. He was 26 years old, considerably younger than Burton. Burton left behind in Dunedin when he went on this 9-week trip his wife Lydia, who was 49. They'd been married 20 years and had several children, the oldest of whom was Una Emma Burton, who, like her father, later on got very much involved in the Shakespeare Club and amateur theatricals. They had a son, Harold Taylor, who was 15 at that time, and a daughter, Ida Lydia, who I don't know if she was 14 or would have been 14. I haven't been able to find out whether she survived birth, so I don't know about her. But there was a younger daughter, Hilda Alice, who was only 7 years old when Alfred left Dunedin for this trip. Burton had been to New Zealand as early as 1856, when he worked for the Auckland Weekly Register newspaper as a printer at that time, and sometime after that he was working in Australia, certainly in Sydney and possibly in Queenstown, as a printer on newspapers there. In 1862 he returned to England, where he managed his father's studios for 2 or 3 years. And following the birth of their daughter Una, Alfred and Lydia emigrated to New Zealand in 1868 and ended up in Dunedin, where they joined Alfred's younger brother Walter John Burton as Burton Brothers photographers. Their partnership was actually dissolved 8 years later, so it didn't last terribly long, with Walter setting up studios of his own. And Alfred apparently bought him out and continued the studio, both operating it himself and also bringing in other photographers and managers to run the business, until he retired in 1898 and took up teaching elocution and English literature. Walter, who was most likely an alcoholic, committed suicide by taking potassium cyanide in his darkroom in 1880. And among the photographers that Burton employed were his son Harold, who went on several expeditions in the South Island, and a man called Thomas Borrow, and latterly he had Thomas Muir and George Moody as managers and photographers with his company, with Burton Brothers. And Muir and Moody eventually took over the company in 1898 and called it Muir and Moody. So some of the photographs you see tonight, slides of the photographs, will have Muir and Moody's name on it. Don't be too frightened about that. Only the 2 or 3 are Muir and Moody's, and I'll point them out. They weren't in the King Country in 1885. By 1885, the Burton brothers had amassed 3,500 whole-plate negatives. That's a negative which is 8.5 by 6.5 inches. These are glass plates, and they're normally trimmed down to roughly 8 by 6 inch proportions. And in addition to that, they'd taken probably just as many, if not more, studio portraits of Dunedinites over those years. Alfred had participated in several pioneering exploits in the South Island, going to the Sutherland Falls, Milford Sounds, and so on. So he's very much among those early artists, photographers, explorers that we have plenty of in this country. And in 1884, he took more than 200 photographs during 2 trips of the SS Wairarapa to what they called the Coral Islands, which was Fiji, Tonga, Samoa, and so on. So that's the situation up to 1885 when that first picture was taken. This is Alfred Burton in 1898 when, on retiring, I think it's 1898 or 6, sorry. Yep. Got to get it right. Sorry, yeah, 1898. He published a carte de visite, a little wee print, mounted on about, 4 inches by 2.5 inch piece of cardboard, something like that. On the back of which was his political manifesto, because he was setting himself up as what he called an independent radical for the city council at that time. And this picture was taken then, so this is him in his 60s. And I'll just show some of the pictures. This one here from the Jubilee number of what was it? I forget the magazine, sorry, newspaper, but it's titled 1,000 Dunedinites of the early 60s. And you can see Alfred Burton over on the far side here, with his brother Walter here, the detail of the studio. As Harvard Knight has pointed out, the family feature quite prominently in here, and I think the Burton brothers themselves appear more than once. But it gives an idea of just how well established they were as portrait photographers in Dunedin. This would be fairly typical of some of the early work from the late 1860s, 1870s. And if you look carefully, you'll see that their names, Burton Brothers Photographers Dunedin, are actually written in pencil on the bottom, of just under the photo on the mount, rather than in the more familiar white lettering that's on most of their pictures. These I've chosen as fairly typical Burton Brothers time photos prior to 1885. The Otira Gorge, Masterton. Burton came through Wellington and via Masterton, Wairarapa, to go up to Wanganui to do this particular trip. And he photographed on the way. he made a joke of how North Islanders thought that the Manawatu Gorge was really something special scenically, and how he felt it, simply didn't compare at all to places such as the Otira Gorge, which he had photographed in extensively. Remuera, Auckland. I should warn you that the slides I'm showing are of various quality, sometimes more than 1 or 2 times removed from the original, so you get different colours. This is a very poor quality slide. You'll see the rich brown tones of the traditional albumen prints that the Burtons used in some of the other slides. But in other, the slides that have very spotty backgrounds such as this, and where the edge shows, those slides are made from contemporary prints, sometimes only rough work prints, from the Burton negatives, which are in the National Museum in Wellington. These are from the 1884 trip. This man is Edward William Peyton. As I said, he was on the 13th of May 1885. He was just a week short of his 26th birthday, and he had only been in New Zealand 2 or 3 years prior to this, so he came in the early 1880s and was tripping around. He drew while he was on his trip. He did quite a few pencil drawings and occasionally coloured them in, such as this one here, which shows Alfred Burton photographing, or at least is supposed to show Alfred Burton photographing. There's no corresponding photograph which shows a Maori holding the taiaha and Mary in that manner, but it's one illustration, and they look a little bit more like sort of classical figures from antiquity. And this one here, called Reciprocity, which shows a rather thin Burton. Burton was quite tall and lanky. He was 6 foot 2 inches high, and so it's possibly looks like he's been shortened somewhat to fit into the camera in this stage. But Peyton was really interesting. He went back to England and did more training as an artist, and set himself up for being the first director of the Elam School of Art here in Auckland. And he took over there about 1890 and was director for about 20 odd years, I think, if not more than that. And what's more significant to us perhaps is that he was a very keen and quite a prolific photographer. So from the turn of the century, when Elam School of Fine Arts used to have its darkroom up in the tower of what is now the public art gallery, the Auckland Art Gallery, but used to be the public library, Peyton used to take photography classes and take his students down to photograph in the wharves and elsewhere around Auckland. So he's actually a prominent and very interesting photographer in his own right, or he became so. And this is one of his photographs, dated I think about 1910, but I'm not certain. And this is another one of Peyton's photographs, dated at a similar period, possibly a tiny bit later. Okay. I think we've got that. Right. Just a very, very quick idea of what the King Country was. Basically, the part of the King Country that Burton was most interested in photographing was from the lower reaches of the Wanganui River up to Taumaranui. Beyond Taumaranui, well actually no, even further up north to Takewesi and whatnot, where the Maori king and the king movement had prohibited Pakihas from going in an attempt to try to hang on to their land and keep the Pakeha out. And there had been a few photographers who had photographed in the area, but not into the sort of centre of the King Country proper. One of the photographers who did work in the King Country area in the lower reaches of Wanganui was William Harding, who had a studio in Wanganui from the late 1850s onward, up until about 1882 when he went to Australia. And this and the next picture are his photographs. And it turns out that another photographer who demands attention that we don't know much about yet, we're not even sure exactly who did what, but there were two surveyors, the brothers Cusson, William and Lawrence Cusson, and I believe these two photographs I'll show you were by Lawrence Cusson. They were surveyors surveying in the northern part of the King Country, and also photographing in places like Te Kuiti, where this picture was taken in 1883 or 1884, so a good year or two before Burton's trip.
Is that returned?
Yes. And you'll see that generally his pictures are more loose and less formal than Burton's overall. And this is almost like a 35mm handheld shot in its feeling. The title is called Willie Cusson, so it's a picture of Lawrence's brother and the Maori woman whose name I don't know. And one of the most exciting things for me, that although I haven't been able to take it further, was to find out in my research that John Rochfort, the surveyor of the Main Trunk Railway line and a prominent figure in the whole surveying of the King Country, and in fact the leader of this expedition that Burton went on in 1885, that he also took photographs. And we found this out from one of Edward Peyton's private albums, in which there are a page of pictures which include this and the next picture, and a small pencil note saying the photographs were by John Rochfort, CE, civil engineer. And, oh, sorry, I've whipped one out to try to get another Burton in later on, sorry. And in the late 1880s we had visits by George Valentine and some other photographer or photographers from the famous Scottish company of Valentine and Company. And this one shows, if Peter can focus, he's having trouble here.
No one should remember that.
Shows the thriving town of Wanganui about the time that Burton started his trip. I don't know if you can read the caption from back there. Can you hear me okay from the back of the room?
Yeah.
Please let me know if you can't. Whati Whareho, King's residence, that's King Tawhio, the Maori king, looking to Kakapuka. You'll have to excuse my pronunciation. One of the things I want to do in this life is to learn Maori, and I do the language a huge disservice, so please forgive me on that. I'll do my best. But the kind of subtitle of this talk was Burton's King Country Trip 1885, sort of revisited in 1987. I can't really live up to that. This talk's not going to be about something like the photographic or re-photographic survey that Mark Klett and I've forgotten her name, sorry, and others have done in the United States, where they've deliberately set out to re-photograph scenes that were done in the 1860s, 1870s by people such as William Henry Jackson and Timothy O'Sullivan and so on. This is not an attempt to do that. The attempt is to look now in 1987 back at that. And 2 years ago, on the centenary of Burton's trip, I did go down to the northern part of the Wanganui, which is all I could manage in May, and sought this village, or the evidence of this village. And it turns out that Burton's King Country trip has become a great deal of mythology, far more mythology than fact anymore, because so many of the places have changed. And the next slide gives you a bit of a hint at what's there now. And it's not taken from exactly the same position, but you can see the mountain in the back, The man on the left was my guide, Jim Mandino, who's director of the Te Ao Mutu Museum, and the Burton picture is held in the book he's got on, which is the picture on the right-hand side is the one we just saw. So you can see there's quite a lot of change that's taken place. So I suspect it's actually impossible to go back on Burton Brothers, on the Alfred Burton strip. However, we can use his writing and go back in that sense. So I'd like to turn the light on while I read this. It's a bit hot and up here with this lamp. Can we have the light on, please? I'll turn that off. Unique in the history of photography in New Zealand, in that not only did Burton photograph, but he also wrote about his journey and published this. He was a smart character who used his printing expertise and wrote up a journal, had it published in the Otago Daily Times. They did all the typesetting, and then he took all the typesetting, which was very labour intensive in those days, and he reshaped it into a little catalogue, added a catalogue of his photos, and then flogged off the catalogue. If you ever see one, grab one. They're rare. There must have been hundreds of them printed, but they're extremely rare. You have to go to places like the Turnbull Library and the National Museum to find them. Well, fortunately, in addition to Burton's photographs and his writing, Edward Peyton, although a youngster in the game, took it upon himself to write a book as well. So in 1888, there was published a book called Round About New Zealand by Edward W. Peyton, published in England by, I think it was Marston Low and Company. And fortunately, in that, Peyton talked about some of the things that happened on that journey with Burton. And it's only in the last, within the last 2 years that I was able to locate Peyton's drawings. So they are an addition. And for anyone who's interested in history, there's loads of other information about the King Country of this time. And one of the major sources, all the various letters to and fro the government in Maori and in English from the King Country Maoris, trying to keep the Pākehā out of their land, or if they let them in, to keep them in on their terms and no others. What I'd like to do is to read Burton's diary from Wednesday, May the 13th, 1885, 102 years ago. Oops, without losing that. All right, so please be patient. Okay. May 13th. Our crew are evidently getting into the swing of it, as they even showed no sign of stopping at Utapa, which we understood was to be the end of this day's work, but gallantly poled us on up to Tukapo, about a mile beyond, which meant 3/4 of an hour overtime. By and by, Ngātai, who was their main Maori guide, explained the reason for this movement. Utapa, it seems, is just a nest of the rankest hauhauism, and our chief, who once an unmitigated rebel himself, now most refreshingly loyal. Hang on, I missed a page. What have I done? No, that's right. Right. Sorry. Is now most refreshingly loyal. Might almost stand a show for election as a Sunday school superintendent, though it thought it well to steer clear of his old associates, and so to keep us, his special charge, out of all possibility of danger. Here lives that old irreconcilable, the chief Taumata, who is believed to have in his whata enough theodolites and other apparatus to stock an instrument dealer's shop as extensive as Mr. A.H. Ross's in the Octagon. The spoils of the various survey parties he has raided, after the manner of the Rhenish barons of olden time. This is the worthy who declared, on the occasion of the imprisonment of Mr. Rochford, that if he had been taken on his land, he would cut all his belongings into small pieces and made slaves of the whole party. Clearly a fellow of some grit. Just the sort of man Mr. Carlyle would have glorified, Thomas Carlyle. As might have been imagined, The reputation of this village and its chieftain proved irresistible to this photographer, and the camera soon shouldered, and the path, and a villainous path it was, to Utapa taken. On the way, a fine view presented itself, which only wanted life. This seemed to be furnished by a native with a most deliciously cannibal-like face, who turned up at the moment. A polite request, conveyed by signs, that he should form an item in the picture was resented in a manner that made the camera tremble to the bottom of its tripod. And the expression which that savage put on, if he was not Taumata himself, he was certainly ugly enough to be that Tory of Maori Tories, let the photographer know plainly enough that instead of making a lifelike picture of him, his tattoo ship would amazingly enjoy the making of a death-like picture of tangata whakaahua, which means the maker of likenesses. Snugly seated at home as I am just now, Burton said, I cannot help wishing that I could truthfully chronicle even a trifling assault on the part of the Utapa malcontents. It would certainly have given a zest to this article, and wouldn't it have sold the photographic series, The Maori at Home. But it cannot be, for the simple reason that, unfortunately, no assault was committed. Not a man, woman or child attempted to go for the taipo, which is Maori for devil or camera, or demon. In fact, leaving out of consideration the verbal compliments couched in the choicest Maori billingsgate that were showered upon us by villagers, for the population, pigs and dogs included, have turned out en masse to our approach, a reception might almost have been regarded as flattering, were it not for the following little circumstance. Two matrons, one of whom had a child slung upon her back, the little dear quite innocent of such appliances as soap and pocket handkerchiefs, and the other, who was beyond a doubt as she would wish to be, did she truly love her Maori lord, were involuntarily posing themselves for a picture, and tangata, already in imagination, seeing a print as an effective incident in the window of number 41 Princess Street, the Burton studio in Dunedin, slipped his head under his black cloth when the ladies, intuitively divining the situation and simultaneously turning around, solemnly assumed a posture of flexure and low bending. Shade of Shakespeare, pardon. Certainly not suggestive of respect, but rather of the most withering contempt for Pākehās in general, and for this Pākehā and his camera in particular. Hitherto, when we were unable to secure a whare all to ourselves, we had pitched our tent even in the middle of a village. But this evening, to save that trouble, we accepted the offer of the friendly people of Tukapo, their behaviour a strong contrast to that of their hauhau neighbours, and turned in among them all in the wharepuni, and a wretched night we had of it. In addition to our 5 whites, in quotes, and our 7 browns, in quotes, there were, I suppose, about 20 others, men, women and children, as the building was by no means large, with no ventilation whatever, the door and the little window carefully closed, and 2 charcoal fires burning in holes in the earthen floor, while nearly everybody smoked, and several of our hosts gave audible proof of their possession of colds in the head and complaints of the chest, it may be imagined that the atmosphere toward the small hours was not laden with the odours of Araby. Ugh! Earlier in the evening, I brought out a small portfolio of views I'd put into my swag at Wanganui, thinking they might interest some of the chiefs on the way. I was soon surrounded by an admiring group who were especially delighted with the camera in the Coral Islands series, saying they were all same Maori, the younger men seizing the pictures of the buxom girls of Samoa and Tonga and kissing them with great ardour. Light in their wharepunis is usually supplied by a piece of charcoal floating in a tin dish of pork fat, a slush lamp, in fact. But in our honour, and to enable the pictures to be seen to advantage, a couple of paraffin candles were bought, fixed into the sockets of bayonets, whose points were readily driven into any part of the floor. The sight of these rusty old arms set us speculating as to how they found their way hither, and we did not feel like asking any questions on the subject of our dusky hosts. That's Burton's diary for that day, this day 102 years ago, on the spot to a Wednesday. Is it pure Victorian soap opera, the stuff that Burton's writing? Is it his fiction? The most refreshingly loyal Maori pitted against a savage cannibal. The Maori Republican rebel against democratic royalist. The Maori chief Taumata is half-jokingly intimated to be a thief for confiscating the tools of the trespassers. Telling the Pākehā he is not wanted is Maori Billingsgate. In other words, it's politely belittled as merely swearing and not the frustrated, angry dialogue that it was intended to be. These protesting Maori are dirty, immoral, and slightly dangerous to the male Pākehā adventurer. There's a familiar ring to this, isn't there? Well, fortunately, Burton's companion in this adventure, Edward Peyton, as I said, only a week short of his 26th birthday, provides his comment on that same day in his book, About New Zealand. And I'd like to read that, it's not terribly long. This is Edward Peyton. We had heard our men talking about some place where there was a large pā, and we wondered why they had not taken us there instead of to Tukapo, which consisted of a wharepuni and 2 dilapidated whares, inhabited apparently by 2 old hags and a very old man. But we found that the neighbouring pā, Utapa by name, was a hotbed of hauhauism. So much so that Ngātai thought it better not to take us there, in case the natives should ill-treat us. But we were not going to pass by this real pā without a visit, and so off we set over the hills. And he never referred to Burton as such, and Burton never referred to him as such as a name, but he called him B dash 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 dash, which sounds like a rude word, but in Peyton's book it took a few years or a couple of years or something to work out who this... Oh, it was easy to find out who B was, but not so easy to find out who P was in Burton's writing. Anyway, B carried his camera, and before we had halfway spied a pretty view of the river that he wanted to immortalise, so we stopped, and I asked a native who was passing to condescend to make a foreground for the view. See, Burton said that he was trying to convey it in sign language, and Peyton, who prided himself on knowing more Maori, he joked about Burton only knowing 7 phrases in Maori and 7 words, but using them very, very well. Anyway, I asked a native who was passing to condescend to make a foreground for the view. As soon as he comprehended what was wanted, to have that he was wanted to have his great person photographed, he turned on us and gave the most awful snort of disgust and rage that I've ever heard, even from a Maori. B did not like the look of his eye and did not ask any more old fellows to have their photos taken for a long time. Arriving at Utapa, we found a large, well-situated village, densely populated by the dirtiest lot of Maoris, both physically and morally, that we had yet seen. However, it was a novelty rather to be rudely treated, and we persisted in seeing all we could of the pā. The old chief, whose whare is said to contain a better selection of theodolites than any shop in New Zealand, all taken from surveyors, would not come outside when he heard that two strange Pakeha were admiring his village. He threatened to shoot my friend Rochford, the surveyor, if he ever came on his land, and to take all his instruments. But can be stern too. He has several times visited Utapa since this, and always carried a revolver. But the loud-talking chief somehow was never at home to carry out his threat. We left our objectionable friends at Utapa before sundown and returned to Tukupo, where our men had taken all our blankets into the wharepuni. The woman of the settlement prepared us an enormous meal of pork, potatoes and some green vegetables that I did not know, and we felt glad that we had some kind of roof over us, as the rain commenced to fall heavily soon after we got back. B seemed rather uneasy at having to sleep in the same whare as some 20 Maoris, men, women and children, but he got used to it before the end of the journey. This night we had to put up with rather greater heat than usual, as they lighted 2 fires inside and closed all the windows and doors, and B didn't sleep much in consequence. You can see that the two men's different views of the same situation. Well, how different are the views? Well, it seems that Peyton is a little bit condescending too of the Maoris when he uses terms like the hotbed of hauhauism, the most awful snort of disgust and rage, even from a Maori, and the dirtiest lot of Maoris, both physically and morally. One could be forgiven for feeling those slightly judgmental terms. The friendlies are old hags when they first meet them, and they become automatically women of the settlement when they cook them a lovely and generous meal. So it changes like that. Such is the language of these colonial Pakeha males and some of their publicly voiced attitudes. So let's now look at their pictures. This is the village of Utapa, and I don't have copies of all the pictures that Burton took. He took over 150 on this trip. I have copies of most, but not all, and I certainly don't have slides of all of them. But what's particularly interesting about this picture is that it's taken of a village from a distance. It's not the usual close-up view that he attempted to get after getting a sort of a general establishing shot. Oops. Right, here we go. Okay. Well, as I mentioned, the journey started in Wanganui, going north. It took them about 2 weeks to reach Taumarunui. They went by canoe. There were 6 Pakehas on the trip, Rochford, Peyton, Burton, and 3 men, Pakeha, who were going up to Taumarunui to work as sawyers and help with surveying in the process. And there were a group of 8 Maori men who paddled and poled them up the river.
What's the word there, John, just below the woman?
Oh, yeah. I think I've probably got on the caption. Nakura, the woman Nakura is named. And what's particularly interesting is that these photographs by Burton brothers were later recycled by Muramudi as postcards, and they're very popular postcards. And this postcard, you can read the message on it, was sent in 1904. It was posted off from Dunedin and on the 30th of December and arrived at its destination in Wellington on the 31st, so the mail was a damn sight quicker than it is today. But this was quite typical, so it was really interesting that quite a lot of these pictures taken a good 15 and even up to 20 years earlier were still being used as typical, I should say, mythological pictures of the Maori. And these are just a few views going up the river slowly. Burton didn't unfortunately use terribly good equipment. His lenses aren't terribly good, they don't stand up to much enlargement. Admittedly, the pictures were designed for contact printing as they were mainly in the 19th century, but compared to, say, the lenses used by people like William Travers or James Bragg or William and Fred Tyree, for instance, Burton's lens wasn't terribly good. And if you look really closely, you need a magnifying glass, you can actually see that there is a village of Athens, Athene, along here. There are actually quarries there, and it continues along that side of the river as well. This is a sort of a hop, skip and a jump on missing villages. And it's interesting to note that, in fact, Burton certainly did not photograph all the villages along the Wanganui River. He probably photographed about a third of them. And partly that would be to do with migration, because the Maoris move from site to site according to the season and growing and all the rest of it, and markets. And so he would only have gone to the ones that were populated generally, but there were some quite large ones that he missed.
How does he know that they're Greek names?
Well, biblical references, and it's to do with the missionary learning, and I'm not a scholar on. Plenty of you would know about Corinth, Athens, London,
But
the journeys of St. Paul, isn't it?
yeah, but I wondered how it had been changed from Maori, how he knew that they were those names.
Ah, right.
Paramuti was
Right.
Florence then.
Right. It was commonly known. Burton, who fancied himself as a, well, he was, teaching elocution later on. He was quite a good Shakespeare scholar, a very good amateur actor, by all accounts. He actually mentions this, that the Maori couldn't pronounce London. So what you get is, or they couldn't pronounce in this way Corinth. So the only way they could say it was like Coroniti, that came out like that. And so therefore the English started to use the Maori sort of incorrect pronunciation of the word as the name of the
So
place.
it's the Maori use of the Greek word, not an European application of the Maori word.
Yes. And these are to show you, it's really, I think, quite significant that of all the village there, if we go back, you'll see there are actually a lot of new buildings, awful lot of European building materials. You can see them here, the main Whaipuni over there, which has a lot of carving in it. Burton did go up close and photograph an old man and a young woman against that, but basically he hid in these pictures the evidence of the new buildings, and you'll see this very clearly from here, that he chose for his major picture this area down here, which has the least position. The position shows the new buildings to least effect. And in the picture that he took when he descended the hill, you'll see that there's only a tiny hint of the new building over the other side on the left there, left middle. I just want to take you closer to look at the expressions. And you can see the fall off of the lens here. It's in photography, when you focus a lens, you actually only focus on one fine plane, but lenses give you depth of field, which brings the other parts sort of more or less into focus. Depending on the quality of your lens, you get the areas closer and further away looking sharper if you have a better lens. And here you can see that this man in the foreground looks distinctly out of focus, whereas in the full version, if we go back, he looks perfectly in focus there. You can see it makes quite a lot of difference looking in close. And we always need to remember that Burton's contemporaries, and right up into the Edwardian age, people were used to using magnifying glasses when they looked at pictures. And so, therefore, you can have a picture with an awful lot of detail on it that you can't really see very well just with the naked eye, but using a magnifying glass you can pick out the details. And that was very common. Okay. Jerusalem. I have to go a little faster. Burton actually hurt himself a couple of times, twisted his ankle or hurt his leg somehow a couple of times on this trip, and was waylaid in Jerusalem for 2 or 3 days. And he was looked after by the Catholic nuns there and the priests. And it's interesting that he didn't take any pictures of them, which perhaps is a little bit surprising, seeing that he would have been, at least verbally, he was very grateful to their help. He probably saved the pictures for the views and the Maoris. And also, he didn't photograph these, the evidence of European buildings and whatnot in the area. When this was published, it was published vignetted. This shape on the top right-hand side there was seen as a mistake, an accident. It's probably the elbow of somebody standing in front of the camera, possibly even Burton himself. It depends if he. But it was published as a circular picture with a soft edge, the vignetted image. And I'll show you a sample of one later on. But I prefer to show the whole image, which I think is a very powerful one. I don't know how many of you saw the film Pictures, which was loosely based on the Burton brothers' lives, but an awful myth, as if there aren't enough myths already about Burton's trip and about the Maori and all the rest of it. There are new myths to do with Alfred Burton and the way he photographed and in a way his integrity as a photographer. And I'd like to demolish one myth tonight, take this opportunity, and that is the myth of Alfred Burton's so-called box of blouses. This myth was unfortunately built up into quite considerable proportions, based on a comment, I believe, by William Mayne in his book Maori in Focus, which was published, I think, 1976, in which Bill mentions that, where are we? That Rane, oh, hang on, this is in another. Oh, right. I'll show you Rane in a moment. Rane appears to be wearing the same shirt or blouse as worn by Irini in a previous illustration. Well, that's Irini in the foreground on the right-hand side here, and I think Rane should be the next one. And no, that's Irini also, and then Rane is here. And so Bill's made that unfortunate comment that she appears to be wearing the same shirt or blouse, and that is rather unfortunate because later on, in Michael King's book, Maori, a Photographic and Social History, which was, I haven't got it, published in 1983, page 82, Michael, commenting on, hang on, which picture? 3, 5, 7, 6. I'm not sure. Anyway, commenting on one of the pictures, which shows this lady here, Rane, says uncategorically that the woman at right, Rhondda, is weaving a flax cloak and wearing one of the blouses that Burton carried around for his Maori models. Prior to that, he had simply said that it appears to be something Burton has done, which is what Bill Main originally said also. And so on it goes. And then in another picture, Michael King says that the woman at right and front really captivated Burton, which is true. But the fact that the blouse she is wearing appears on at least one other model has led to suspicions that the photographer might have been dressing up his subjects as he travelled. That's my emphasis. And it's simply not true. And we'll show you and demonstrate it, I think. But in the film pictures, there are about half a dozen scenes, the film that Michael Black directed. There are half a dozen scenes in which the guy acting as Alfred Burton delves into this box of blouses and hands it to the Maori woman to wear. And it's completely fiction, as much of that film was. But anyway, it's reached sort of ridiculous proportions. So much so that I thought I'd better mention it tonight, because one of the ladies in the anthropology department of the university mentioned this to me, and I just about blew up. And it seems such a silly kind of thing that's got out of all proportions. But anyway, I think there's sufficient proof if you look closely. Mainly it's a matter of looking closely at the pictures. If you go close, you look at that particular blouse, you notice the series of buttons down the front there, and the collar, the tight buttoned up collar pattern of that. It's either whether it's an actual patchwork cloth, or whether it's a pattern that's based on patchwork. I'm not 100% sure by analysing the photos. But if you look at that closely, you see it's quite a different garment from one that Rhondda's wearing, which has this, it doesn't have the buttons, it doesn't have that tight sort of top, and it has this dark seam down here. And if you look at a sharper version, you see that the actual patterns on the cloth itself are in completely different positions from the one that Rhondda's wearing. And I think this is fairly good proof that Alfred Burton did not take a box of blouses with him when he went on this trip, and he did not distribute them to Maori women. And in fact, there's evidence in his writing and in Peyton's to suggest almost the opposite, that, for instance, Peyton, in his comments which relate to the 6th of May events, says that Burton was much discussed because the native woman of Parakino, which was would not allow themselves to be photoed unless they put on their best European garments, utterly refusing to be made immortal in everyday attire. And later on the 19th of May, Burton meets a buxom lass called Matarine, who consents to have a portrait taken, all same Samoan, which presumably means topless, when they get to Taumarunui. But in fact nothing happened. She didn't turn up, but sent a letter to him saying, if you want your picture you have to give me money and a box of matches and other things that she desired. And so that never happened. And it's actually well established. For instance, way back in the 1820s, the painter Augustus Earle was grizzling because so many of the Maoris at that point were wearing European clothes and sort of spoiling the picturesqueness that he wanted to capture. And so he deliberately excluded anybody who wore European clothes from his pictures. And however, there is, whilst there's no evidence at all to show that Burton did in fact have a box of blouses, there is evidence, as I'll indicate later on, that the Maoris were quite happy and often did swap cloaks for their pictures. You see one particular cloak that does the rounds, and it appears on about half a dozen people at least, and we'll see some of those later on. I don't have the slide of the full version of this particular picture of a group of about 8 women at Te Eke on the Wanganui River, but just a few details, and I can show you the book later on, which has got the full version in it.
Excuse me, do you mind
Yes.
if we ask questions or
Go
we have
ahead.
questions at the end?
Go ahead, that's fine, we'll see how we work.
No, there was just one I wanted to ask. That photograph earlier outside the big meeting house, what sort of exposure time would he have had to everyone sitting awfully stiffly?
Right, yeah. Well, he was using dry plates, which meant that he could. It was about 3 years, 2 years, 3 years. No, hang on, sorry, rubbish. It was about 5 years after dry plates were introduced in New Zealand. Prior to that, the photographers had to make their own plates and process them on the spot. He was using dry plates, which allowed him to photograph, store the negatives, and take them back to Dunedin to process. I just put these in, just come back to that, to show some typical Burton Brothers studio portraits, just to compare them to these details of the expressions on the Maori woman in the prior photo. So the process at that time of exposing was by capping and uncapping the lens, which took several seconds, so that the exposures would be in the vicinity of seconds. Depending on the weather, and the weather was now, it's autumn and very, very wet often. Generally, you have in Burton's photographs the Maoris looking, unless he's posed them differently, looking straight at the camera, or unless they don't want to, they're frightened of it or whatever. And whereas so often in the commercial portraits, there's very much a kind of a standard pose, and people are able to kind of act out a pose and look into have a three-quarter view. Several of those are frontal, but you can see also the ones with the head slightly turned. Burton goes into quite a lot of detail talking about some of these pictures. The old man is Tapini Te Mamuka, or Mamaka, who was reputed to be 100 years old, and Burton had quite a lot of fun, as did Peyton, sort of joking about the fact that they had several Maoris in the group trying to work out just how old old Tapini was, and Burton joked that they'd collectively come up with 160 years, and whereas Tapini said he was about 110 or something like that. It was a lot of fooling around, but Peyton also did a drawing of the old man, and Peyton prided himself on being able to speak a reasonable amount of Maori. I really don't know how versed he was in Maori, but he would appear to have spent a lot more time with the Maori people than Burton did, and it's quite likely had a reasonable vocabulary. Certainly Tapini sort of enjoyed meeting him and talking to him. A lot of the pictures that Burton took are very much to do with looking at what things were, which is a bit like today. You have photographers in 1987 going around photographing buildings that were built 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 or more years ago, and hardly anybody photographing those that have been built this year or last. And you get the similar kind of thing. So there's quite a lot of emphasis on photographing old people or old places, and one can't help but think about the likely symbolism of this, that you have the Maori, that ruined whare probably represents, the end of the Maori's occupation in the King Country and the opening up to the Pakeha. And there's the full version with Rhondda on the right. Burton and Peyton agreed that Taumarunui was one of the worst hovels, the worst villages that they had been to, and that it was very, very dilapidated. And it was, they claimed, being kind of carved up by two brothers, Taitua and Ngatai, I think, Yeah, they're one of the helmsmen on the canoe, and that they were sort of deliberately burning down the old forest, according to Burton, to kind of improve the property, as it were. But I don't know how much truth was in there. But once again, this is by no means the best specimen of any partika, the food house, that could have been found, but that's the one that was photographed. There were other villages that were more in use than this one at that time.
So they put a mirror movie.
Right, yeah, and this one also. Yeah, just when Muir and Moody took over in 1898, they put their name on the Burton photos. There's Peyton dressed up on the left there in a cloak. It was recorded that both Burton and Peyton, at some stage in that latter part of the journey, did purchase cloaks from the Maoris. There's a young man there holding a watch. Looks like he's timing the exposure at the same time. And there's another sequel to this picture I won't be showing tonight, which shows them without Peyton dressed up. He's without Peyton in the picture, in fact, just with the Maori group by themselves. Burton and Peyton spent 10 days or so in Taumanu. That was the end of the river trip, essentially, and they had to wait there until John Rochford, the surveyor, came back. He'd been off surveying somewhere. And so they, according to Peyton, Burton sort of exhausted most of his photographic plates the first few days, went around photographing like crazy, and then got rather bored and hang around making a nuisance of himself for the rest of the time. Some of the pictures are very romantic, like this one and probably the next one. Oh no, not that one. And some of them seem much more straightforward, almost sort of journalistic somehow, photojournalistic. Picture of Peyton. The picture's called Native Critics. Peyton talked about whether or not the Maoris thought that his box of coloured paints and his paintings were more or less interesting than the photographs, and even though the Maoris couldn't see the result of Burton's photographs, they thought that the machine was, he thought, a bit more interesting than the colour palette that he used. One of the few Maori female chiefs photographed by Burton, but he and Peyton made quite a lot of to-do about this, that she was, that her husband was very deferential and sort of ran after and put a cloak on her and very much looked after her, which, as you know, typical Victorian gents, would have been rather foreign, or rather, foreign to them. This tomb was also photographed by Cusson, by Lawrence Cusson, a couple of years earlier. Yeah, that's one of the most kind of romantic, sort of formal studio type portraits that he did on the trip, and it's not actually typical of most of them. There was a bit of flattery going on here. I think this was the chief who gave Burton the greenstone pendant, and I suspect the photograph was done as a thank you for that. So it's especially posed. There's an awful lot in the Burton diaries and Peyton's. There's an awful lot about how rotten the Maoris were for arresting Charles Hursthouse, another surveyor, and imprisoning him for 80 hours. And then Hursthouse was rescued by friendly Maoris, organised by Wahanui. And this man here is he's got underneath there Mr. Hursthouse's chief assailant, Teima Mahuka. And Paru Ka was this chap's assistant in trying to keep the Pākehās out of their village, off their land, but to no avail. interesting, but the only photograph, except for ones with Peyton, which shows a rifle or any sort of firearms, apart from Maori weaponry. And Peyton also made much ado about his shooting prowess, shooting pheasants left, right, and centre. And he liked to go out pig hunting, carrying on. For the lady who was asking a question about the exposure, this picture is actually a very good illustration. If you look at the picture generally, it looks very spontaneous. It looks like it could almost be a 35mm photo taken in quite a short exposure. But if you look closely at the legs of the man on the left of the picture there, you'll see there's a leg sticking out, a little wee child's leg, and a kind of a blurry mark around the lower part of his blanket. And this, I think it's a little child or children whirring around his body during the exposure. So it must have been a reasonably long exposure, probably as much as 5-10 seconds, something like that, although the picture has a very spontaneous feel to it. It's called persuading a sitter. It's interesting also that Burton separated, generally, not always, he did mixed groups, but he often tended to separate the males from the females, and so you get this picture here which shows the men and the men, in action, typical kind of sexist history stuff, and then you get the group of the women who are there, all kind of almost not quite coward, but sort of sitting there, looking at the camera, but certainly not active, but passive, and you get these kind of balances quite often. Another thing that's been said about Burton, which doesn't seem to hold any truth, was that his brother Walter and later other managers and photographers who ran his studio were the portrait photographers, and that Alfred was the outdoor man. That's far too simplified to be true. And there's on record, for instance, Sir David Munro, when he visited Dunedin, had his photograph taken by Alfred Burton and commented on what a thoroughly nice chap he was. And I've seen the portrait, which is quite a reasonable one. And also, if you look at these outdoor portraits, you'll see quite a lot of the formal, standard, traditional indoor portraiture posing that goes on. And just bear that in mind when you look at this series of portraits.
Was there any reason for the hat removed?
I'm sure there is. And if you think of it in terms of photography, the lighting is coming pretty much directly from above. So if he had a hat on, it's very likely to shade his eyes and his forehead, nose and face and features. So it's possible that he was asked to have it removed. It's possible that there are other pictures of it which show it lying around on the floor, on the ground. So it's possible it just was sort of kicking around of someone's that they put up there and possibly forgot about. But that's the same man, Weteri Te Ringa here, dressed up in his Maori blanket, or the Pākehā blanket, but dressed up in what was seen to be a less European way. And you get these changes, te here. This is the cloak that is used by several people. For instance, Weteri's wife. I'm fairly sure it's the same cloak. It's got a this fringe here and this pattern here and the pattern here coincide with the cloaks in several, and I suspect it's very likely to be the same cloak, which isn't as surprising as changing blouses. I don't think anyway.
Is there a chance it was one of the ones purchased by Burton?
Possible. That's a line of inquiry. Yeah. There's a vignetted shot here that Burton hasn't quite. I'm not showing you the other one, but in the original plate, there's a big mark here, an accidental processing mark on the plate, which they've sort of retouched on the print. Up on the top right here, there's another sort of gouge in the emulsion of the negative, and that would have been considered an aesthetic failure at that time. So they have vignetted the picture to remove that, the evidence of that, although not completely. Rowi Maniapoto. personally think these are some of Burton's finest portraits, and show quite a lot of ability in that way. But once again, it's interesting seeing these old men in a kind of a open environment with no details, no history, nothing behind them, just out there in space, and can't help thinking that that's be the background, the blank background, everything that's been used symbolically, not just to isolate the people, but also to almost suggest them fading away, like the background. Taonui. These chiefs, by the way, were, in fact, the very meeting that Burton attended, or he didn't attend, he was invited to have afternoon tea with them, but the very meeting that he was able to photograph these people at was there to discuss the issues of land, the problems associated with the Pākehā taking over the land, and the surveyors coming in and all the rest of it. And this issue of the land was very, very much in their minds at the very time when these pictures were taken. And there's a huge amount of documentation in government archives about all the legitimate ways that the Maoris, trying to use Pākehā laws, tried to get back their land or to keep their land and keep the Pākehā out. Okay. Well, that's the end of the last picture. Was the last of Alfred Burton's photographs I want to show tonight. I just want to show a few more pictures of Utapa. This was the village that rejected Burton originally, and Peyton tried to keep them at bay, keep them out. Photographed later. This is a genuine Muramudi photograph from which they went back in 1901 and photographed in that village. And you might remember the other photo I showed you the village tucked in behind. There was a very tangly tree up here in the foreground, and you could just barely see the village sort of tucked in behind there. And here they are right in the middle of it. It's all opened up, and you have this version. And I don't know, oh that's right, this is also, I think this is the Muramudi also, version taken after the turn of the century also, about the same time, of some of the people in that same village. And if you look closely, you'll see that there are considerable changes in attitude toward the Pākehā, even smiles. I think there are about, in the Burton photos from this trip that I've got, I think there are about 5 photographs which show people with a bit of a grin on, a bit of a smile. Otherwise they're fairly stiff and po-faced, posing for the camera. But there are a few smiles now and again, not very often.
What do you attribute the smiles to?
Right, well partly it's to the camera being so slow originally and speeding up. When Muramudi were working, they were actually using shutters then, so they were working in fractions of a second, say a 15th of a second, half a second, in that vicinity, whereas Burton was working in several full seconds. And in addition, and it's very much implied by the opening up of the village to visitors and whatnot, is that people, the Maoris themselves, were forced to give up their resistance and put up with the Pākehā visitors and perhaps try to make the best of it in the process. And so I'd like to end the slides with this detail from that previous picture, which I don't want to comment on, but I'll leave it there. Thank you. Right. So, if you have any questions, you're welcome. Where's Rhondda? She's been very kind to me. She insisted that I could only go on for an hour, which is terribly painful for me. I've actually got notes I won't be using properly, but maybe she's been banished tonight. But if there are any questions, I'd welcome them. I've got plenty more to say, but I've got a problem. I don't want to bore you silly. Burton died in 1914. So he lived a pretty long life. He was, 80? Yeah, 80 years old when he died. He was born in 34. So he had a pretty good wicket. And he was survived for a few years by his wife Lydia, and she died a few years later, and then survived by his daughters. His son, Harold, quite early on, when he was, I think, about 20, he lost an arm in an accident, which sort of prevented him from continuing helping his father photograph. And then, not so many years later, I forget exactly when, I could find out, he died prematurely when he fell off a horse and died from the what do you call it, complications or wounds or whatever from that fall.
The 1901 urine Moody had Protected and then gave the date.
Right.
What's Protected?
Right. Protected is really strange. If you look at the work of Frank Denton in Wanganui, for instance, he's got a picture of Maori men dressed up in the old, the flax cloaks and whatnot, posing there, sitting on chairs, posing like the kind of local football club, and underneath it's got F.A. Denton, Frank Denton, Maori warriors protected in the year. It looks like the Maori warriors are protected, but in fact it's copyright protection. Yeah. What happened was in Burton's, everybody did it up until, I suppose up until about the 1890s. Nobody took any notice of people copying one another's work. And it was very common not only for studios to buy out each other's work. Burton, for instance, purchased or acquired, I don't know how they got them, they acquired photographs from Hart Campbell and Company of Invercargill. And they also acquired some of the most exciting portraits by the American Photo Co., which was a photography studio in Queen Street, Auckland. And they actually used these early portraits as their pictures, and even in some cases enlarged them up and sold them off as Burton Brothers photos. But they weren't taken by Burton or Burtons. I'm particularly interested at this stage to ascertain exactly which pictures were taken by Alfred Burton and which were taken by his brother or his employers or other people. But it's a very slow process. Fortunately, Harwood Knight's done a lot of work, and he's, for instance, come up with, he and Marshall Seifert in Dunedin have come up with the names of a man such as Thomas Borrow, who worked with Burton from 1880 on, and apparently was quite a prolific photographer in his own right. So he's another kind of Burton Brothers photographer. But I wanted to concentrate on Alfred's work mainly.
John, was that his main North Island expedition?
No, it's Burton did 3 journeys in which he both photographed and wrote and published the writings of. He in 1884 he did the Coral Islands, My Camera in the Coral Islands, which was published as a newspaper and also a catalogue along with photos. He did King Country in 1885, and in 1889 he did a trip called Wintering on Lakes Tiano and Manapuri, in which he also wrote a photograph and wrote. So those are kind of, they're special because you get his word pictures as well as his photographs. But in fact, he had photographed, as that picture of Remuera showed, he'd photographed throughout the country and in Auckland quite considerably up until he retired, really, the late 1880s. So he would make quite frequent trips throughout the whole country. And we've got a rather embarrassing situation. Paul McCready, who's doing a MPhil at Elam, has been studying early photographers of Auckland to try to find out if any of them had a real passion for Auckland and, did much. And one of the embarrassments is this damn Dunedin photographer, Burton Brothers, or the photographers, that did probably more and often better photographs of Auckland than local people have done in the 1880s and 1890 period. So he actually did extensive travelling, and after he finished with this King Country trip, he actually went up to Auckland, I think continued to photograph before he went back to Dunedin, where he arrived 2 days conveniently before his 51st birthday. So he was able to have his birthday party after all at home. Okay.
John Burton's trip to the King Country, was that actually commissioned, or was that sort of self-prompted to,
Yeah,
in the hope of selling
right. It was
back?
very much initiated by himself. As I understand it, he was on one of his regular North Island trips. He had been thinking for some time about trying to get into that middle of the North Island, as a lot of Pakihas had, land and potential of gold and all sorts of things with some of the inducements. And although he pretends it was entirely coincidental, he took the precaution of dropping into Wellington to government departments there to get a letter of introduction to Rochford, the surveyor, in case he met him. I think, in fact, that the meeting, he met Rochford. He says that he met Rochford in the Rutland Arms Hotel, sort of accidentally, that he heard a waiter sort of saying, yes, Mr. Rochford. And then Burton went over and talked to him and, say, hey, mate, I'd like to come with you on that trip. But I don't know if it was more set up than that. I'm not entirely convinced it was that fortuitous. He was prepared, but at that time there was absolutely no guarantee that a Pakeha could actually get through the centre of the King Country. It wasn't so much getting through alive, but it was getting through with his gear intact and being able to keep the pictures and not have them destroyed. It wasn't as tough as him likely to be murdered or anything like that. Well, that was always a possibility, which he played up for his audience.
Those surveyors were for the railway?
Yes, yeah. Rochford was the surveyor of the main trunk railway line, and at one stage in the early 1880s, well, I think it's interesting, in the early 1880s he was actually surveying the Wanganui River, the upper reaches of the Wanganui River, for a possible line through there, railway line, and they decided in favour of the one that we know about, Taihape and so on, and that changed things considerably. But you get it. Both Burton and Peyton play off the Maoris an awful lot. They really do go into kind of making them villains or heroes, and it's quite frightening in a way. But also I think they were very, very typical of the time. Their attitudes, which are very chauvinistic. There's no doubt that they thought that the Europeans, and especially Britons, were kind of God's own, and that the Maori were a definitely inferior race, and yet they do funny little things by comment on how the Maoris feel themselves superior to the Pakeha. But all the writing and all the kind of the weight that writing has comes down very heavily on their attitude. That the Maoris had to change. They had to become civilised, and they were carrying the banners of civilisation, and like it or not, they had to go along with it. That comes through very, very strongly. I might can you tolerate another 5 minutes? So just a few things. One of the difficult things for me, and it's an ongoing process, basically I've been mucking around with Burton's photographs ever since I met them when I was photographer at the National Museum in the middle 1960s, and I've been working on plodding away over the years on a book which sort of recreates this journal, and this is, crudely speaking, this kind of the picture part of it anyway, with the pictures set in Burton sequence. This, incidentally, on that one there, is the picture I didn't show you the full version of. I just showed you details of that. But what I'm trying to do is reconstruct that journey from several points of view. It's a bit lighting, and now more information about Rochford into Shakespearean theatre as amateurs, or two of them did anyway. Seems to me he was very confident about his ability to change the world and improve a lot for himself and his family especially. He certainly had a sense of history. He certainly knew that he had a role in life that was of considerable importance, as well as having a role on the stage very often. And he jokingly calls himself, and quote, a a sort of colonial Dr. Syntax in perpetual pursuit of the picturesque. And although he was joking about it, there's actually a lot of truth in that. Dr. Syntax was the books about Dr. Syntax, which were written by William Coombe, were very, very popular in Burton's youth. And essentially they are about this comic priest, parson, who gets bored with being a parson and, it's just not taking him anywhere. So he leaves his wife and he takes his horse and he goes off to London on the journey, and he writes about his journey. And his idea, this wonderful idea, is that he's going to make a fortune by going on a journey, having an exciting life, and writing about it and making money from the writing of thereof. And that's what he did. And there's several parts of this. One of them is Dr. Syntax in search of a wife, and another one's in search of the picturesque, and so on. So, but this search for the picturesque is very much part of the whole kind of Victorian and Edwardian art-making thing. There are very, very few painters, photographers, or anybody who went to quite a major extent trying to make a picture of something. They had a clue about what they wanted, the kind of thing, and that tended to mean that they would dolly up scenes a little bit and look for a certain kind of scene and ignore other ones, and perhaps in front of their nose. So when the choice was between perhaps trying to show something accurate and truthful about something and making a picture that had appeal, the tendency would be to go for the picture that had appeal, the picturesque. Burton was a very good storyteller, and I think his writing illustrates that. There's so many times that he just takes the story and he pulls it out and stretches it and, gets the turn of phrase, which makes the whole thing more interesting for his audience. If he had any qualms about the superiority of Victorian Pākehā culture in the face of Maori culture, or other cultures for that matter, he seldom voiced them, except perhaps with a bit of humour or rhetoric. He did have a sense of humour and he could laugh at himself, but he didn't laugh at himself in the way that Peyton did. Peyton laughed at Burton in different ways, very much the young man scoffing at the older man. And for instance, Peyton recounts a scene which Burton doesn't even mention, in which he and Burton decided at Tamaroo they'd make a loaf of bread, and so Peyton got all the ingredients and put them together, and Burton reckoned he was pretty good at stoking the fire and keeping that going, and Burton burnt this thing, and Peyton made a great to-do about how long it took the Maoris to scrape through the bread to find actual bread in the middle of it all, and he called Burton that the bread had been ruined by an over-officious and ignorant stoker. But there's a lighter side also, that Burton and Peyton were there. You can imagine them there in Taumarunui teaching the Maoris how to dance the polka, and they would introduce cricket and rugby to them. And so there was this kind of thing going on as well. Burton was very much against the taking of alcohol, except for medicinal purposes, and that was one of the reasons he stood as a local councillor. He didn't get in, by the way, in 1898. He called himself an independent radical. This was in 1896. He saw himself as a Democrat, in other words, in favour of referendum on all sorts of important issues, including alcohol. And he was for, he said, the general lifting up of the mass of people, and so on, fairly liberal kind of pursuits, but it seems like the Maoris somehow got left behind in this. And he doesn't appear to be aware of the contradictions in his stance vis-a-vis Pākehā European society and Maori society. He was a minor capitalist who put his savings into private property and into gold mining shares. And he certainly liked adventure, which I think is one of the reasons that he left England in the first place, and he wanted to go where he had never been before. So, in other words, he was thoroughly pragmatic. He was thoroughly typical of the kind of pragmatic adventurist that adventurous middle-class Victorian colonist, of which we had a lot in our early days. and they came here to improve their lot, and indeed he was one of the people who succeeded. He did grizzle when he retired, when he grizzled to the newspaper and said that he regretted that he hadn't made more money. But he had several £100 in the bank, and so he couldn't have been too poor. And in my own opinion, I see the work of Peyton and Burton as a special legacy to us. Like looking at some of the kind of their warts and pimples and all the rest of it, you still have to say, okay, what do you think of them? Were they honourable people? I think yes. Their work is their legacy to us. It's our inheritance rather, for us to do with it what we wish to. And I think one of our tasks, 102 years later or more, is to not only sort out the myths from the truths, but with that new understanding of the dirty side of colonialism, and there's plenty of dirt in the imperialist pursuit, to find ways of not making the same kind of mistakes today in our society. And I think we should remember that the camera, like words, is never impartial, and that, as Michael Turnbull points out in his book, The Changing Land, which is published in 1975, that photographs like this, that such records are like blows in the conflict that they claim to describe and understand. And he also points out that it's actually easier for people removed from a period to understand that period than it is for the people within that to understand themselves. And I think that's a really important thing. So these photographs and the writing, I think, is extremely important. They're extremely important documents for investigation, for helping us to understand who we are, in fact. Okay, thank you. If anyone would like to look at the book with more images, you're welcome.